Thank you so much for coming, taking the time here before lunch to chat about GenAI and personalization recommendations. I'm Bryce Macher. I'm the VP of Personalization and Recommendations at NBC Universal. I do understand those are two different fields, personalization and recommendations, so the marketing folks in the room will be like, thank goodness we finally understand that there are two different things happening here, personalization and recommendations, but they work hand in hand, and one of the interesting things about GenAI is it brings them together in fun and fascinating ways. So what we're going to talk about in our time together and what we're not going to talk about. I'm going to start with the strategy behind this, because here's the thing. You can't scale a money pit. And when you start with personalization and recommendations, you run the risk of scaling a money pit. You add GenAI onto it, your LLMs, your image generation, and you get like a whole planet-sized money pit that'll swallow the world. So we want to make sure that the strategy underneath, the data strategy, the business strategy is sound, and so I always like to start there. Then we'll talk about LLMs across the customer funnel, where we start with personalization and where we can see LLMs working, both middle of funnel and bottom of funnel. That's where I'm going to focus. There's some cool top of funnel stuff you have, but again, we'll talk about that in the panel next for acquisition. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the unsung hero, the thing that nobody's talking about right now, but is going to become very important to the technical side of all personalization and recommendation programs, and that's going to be data synthesis. There's two elements here. There's one thing called synthesis and one thing called distillation. We'll kind of mash them together. Sorry, technical folks in the room. We can whip out the whiteboard and markers later. And then finally, we'll just kind of cover the CX framework that we started with. What we're not going to cover is we're not going to dive into GenAI apps. Whole application API infrastructures are very important here, but we're going to try and connect the big picture with how things work so that you're empowered to then talk about those two things and what you want out of them. So about me, like I said, I'm at NBC Universal. My team is responsible for personalization and recommendations across Peacock, Sky Showtime, and Showmax. Historically, I've worked at a lot of different media companies, some big name brands that you've seen there doing personalization and recommendations, as well as more generalized data science, and then also a couple of technical companies, and done a lot of consulting on my own. So about 20 years of data science experience. I started back when we called ourselves statisticians, and then also doing some consulting and data strategy work on the side. So let's talk a little bit about the foundations here. The strategy behind using generative AI is really about good strategy, which is pulling the thread of fundamentals through AI. Not abandoning, not being distracted by or disrupted by, but pulling that thread of fundamentals through. Strategy is about depth. It's not necessarily about horizon. And the trick is that the technology changes so rapidly that without focusing on the fundamentals, you run the risk of getting derailed by the technology and losing your own business. So that's always the caveat to start with. AI-driven customer experience is both an art and a science, just like AI itself. You can have the best models in the world, you can have the best scientists in the world, the best engineers in the world, and none of it will work. Because it's a bet, it's a risk. You can de-risk to an extent, just like building AI models or machine learning models. If you think about your classic media mix models or MTAs, they're still risky. They're not guaranteed to work. And so you have to have an appetite for risk to jump into this area. And in order to keep that appetite well in control, again, focusing on fundamentals. Second, blitzscaling and hypergrowth. These are words that are getting used a lot in generative AI. Always like to make this caveat. These are really just the cut price ad capacity of the 1960s. Thanks, Boston Consulting Group. Still an age-old truth. And the trick to using generative AI in a business context, using personalization and recommendations, is to cut price, add capacity up front. Get that market share, make the investment now, and reap the rewards later down the road. Here are the two pieces where we start to get into generative AI. Front end, buy versus build versus hybrid decisions are driven by the fundamentals. And the fundamental rule in buy versus build versus hybrid decision is this. You can go and buy generative AI off the shelf. Right? You get a massive model, and then you add a little piece of your data to it, and voila, it's ready to go. You can build. You can say, we're going to hire some of the best minds. We're going to get 5 of them. We're going to lock them in a room for 2.5 years, and they're going to build our own bespoke solution. And then you have the kind of third option, which is let's buy now, let's consider, and then let's build. That decision should be driven by one fundamental business truth. Is the thing that we're building central to our line of business? If the answer is no, if you're not going to be selling your large language model for marketing, I would suggest a buy, right? Otherwise, you're throwing resources into this risky bet. The other option would be your hybrid option. Let's buy now, reap the benefits, and then transition off because it's a cost issue. Those are the two things for the front end, buy versus build. And by front end, I mean your actual front end personalization and recommendations. The back end kind of generative AI part is really about the fundamentals and data maturity in a regulation landscape. If you're looking at data synthesis, and you may be after this, I would just suggest buy. Build is a really risky option because as the regulation landscape changes with CCPA, with GDPR, as LPBD from Brazil comes into play, as we're seeing other countries introduce these new forms of data regulation that impact the way that you transform direct customer data, you might want a solution that's thinking about that, scaling with it, and going forward. These are very, very intense engineering components for the back end. And so there's a question and trade-off there as well. So with that, let's dive into actually talking about generative AI. This is the animation slide. So hold off with that phone. Let's see this play through. So personalization, just to ground things. Basically, you end up with a bunch of recommendations. I live in the content world. And you see content recommendations, lots of different content recommendations. Then we bring them together onto a page. This might be a marketing email, might be the product. And then we'll sort them horizontally to get the highest probability click in the front of the tiles, and we'll sort them vertically. This is called a stage-wise recommendation. And then we offer it to the user. That's the historic way that recommendations work. LLMs have thrown a huge disruptive curve here. So at a high level for marketing folks, an LLM is predicting the next word, grammeme, and syntag meme using probability distributions. Now, not everybody has PhD in linguistics, so let me explain what those are. Words we know, right? We're all friends with words. Grammemes are things like prepositional phrase. They're grammar pieces, right? A preposition is made of a noun, a preposition. It's a prepositional phrase. So grammemes. And then syntag memes, pieces of meaning. So think of these as like clauses in a sentence, something before a comma. What an LLM does is it's shifting through the probabilities that all of these things align and creating a document. Now we can introduce and use different parameters so that it doesn't quite sound so robotic, and we introduce some error so that you don't realize it's a bot, and you can even ask it to introduce common spelling mistakes so that your professor doesn't realize you just generated a paper before turning it in 5 minutes ago. That's all part of how this pipeline works. So, classic LLM, we enter a prompt. It takes it and encodes it. And in this encoder, we have a large web corpus like Google Books, if you're using GCP's Bard. It's built off of Google Books, so you know that it has some highbrow taste. If you use some of the other LLMs out of the box, they're trained on social media like Tumblr, not so high taste. Which model you use, and this is an important piece that I should have put here, which model you choose should align with your use case. You should know what the training text or corpus is to make sure you're using the right thing. If you want to get the young hip kids to use your app, make sure it's got social in there. Don't go straight to the Encyclopedia Britannica version, right? It won't quite communicate the way you expect it to. So the training data really matters here, that large web corpus. You, of course, add in some of your specialty documents. This might be things like show summaries or synopses or closed captions or other types of metadata for programming. And that's really to give the model something to hook onto, to learn that's about you. So you're not just using a generic thing. Now what it does is it calculates that distribution. That's that second red box. Figures out how to compose a document. It uses a mask layer then to check that document, to think about, are these the right distributions? Do I need to introduce noise, what we would call jitter to it? And then it decodes those vectors. These are big sparse number matrices that you wouldn't know what to do with. Puts it into a document and poof, we've got an AI-generated document. Now the cool thing about what LLMs are doing is this middle part doesn't care about your words. It actually doesn't use words. It transforms these into numbers or to matrices. Things that capture relationships between positions of objects. That's the magic behind this. We're reading it as words. We're like, wow, it's talking to me. It doesn't know what the thing means that it's spitting out. It has no clue. Now, that's scary and incredibly liberating, because what that does is it creates a world, another animation slide, so please don't shoot this one yet. So what that does is we can take 3 types of content, sports, live, and your typical series, and we can tell it, hey, organize these entities in a way that tell a story about your user journey, your viewer journey. Develop a bunch of different content rails. You don't need an editorial team to do that. It's helpful to have an editorial team to do that because they can check you. But then you can create entire dynamic pages based on that. This is the recommendations world, but personalization is a step further. With personalization in an LLM, we can use what's called a backpack model. This little box on the bottom is a little backpack. The LLM, the same way, right? Entities in, relationships, thing out. But let's say we're doing next best action. I want to make sure I keep a user. I want to offer them a deal. I want it to be convincing, but I don't want it to be too good because I'd like to keep my bottom line healthy. So my backpack is into a reinforcement. See if it fits with the price. Regenerate the text if you need to be more sensitive to the price. LLM, I want you to write copy that sells, not just copy that's personalized. And that's a really different kind of engagement, but it's a way of generating a lot of interesting action, because what you get on the other side of it is no longer a document that the machine doesn't really understand, but it's an action. So you end up with your recommendation LLM creating all these exciting, interesting recommendations for a person, things that they'll be like, wow, I want to watch that. And then also generating copy that talks about how good of an offer this is for you. Now, the important thing about this and that little backpack and why we want to use a machine learning model there is I was having this conversation with a really smart CEO the other day, and he was saying, you know, what happens, like, this thing's just going to optimize itself to outbid me, right? It's going to always be in the best interest of the user. No, because that reinforcement learning model is thinking about reward, context, and punishment. So it knows that there's this thing called carryover effect, and it's going to hang out. It might send the same email twice. It might wait a couple days. Maybe it'll pop up on your app and be like, hey, remember I sent you that email. And then it'll change the price, because it's that little backpack is a machine learning model. It's not just a rules-based engine that you're serving the same copy up and then walking your price down. So that's how LLMs work in the front end. But there's an interesting sea change coming. One of the conversations that's happening quite a bit, and marketing folks know this, is that the off-platform world is starting to influence how on-platform personalization and recommendations work. So the off-platform world, depending on your legal department, will interpret it as you cannot use on-product data to provide off-product personalization that is intended to then translate into on-product behavior. Iffy, depends on how you interpret it, but that's the world we're thinking of, is a really hyper-regulated world. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with a world in which product data has to be on product and marketing data has to be on marketing, and the two can't cross? That's where generative AI creates a very interesting solution called synthesized data. Let me show you how this works, and again, data scientists in the room, don't throw stuff at me. This is a generative adversarial data synthesis. So we take our real data, and we stick it in a generator. That generator is going to generate synthetic data, and then it's going to pass it to a discriminator. The discriminator is going to take our real data and our generated data and say, can I tell these are different? Can I tell which one of these is fake? If it can, it'll update the weights, pass the data back through, and try again. And just does that over and over again until the synthetic data is near indistinguishable from the original. This is how clean room technology works, for example, if you're using a data clean room. And so what we get is a synthetic data set. You know what's cool about the synthetic data set? It doesn't represent somebody's behavior. Right? It's ontologically different. It is a generated set of attributes about a user. It is not the behavior of a user. So then you have a synthetic data set that you can use to power both sides of the personalization and recommendation world. Why does that matter? Well, for 2 reasons. The first is this allows us to scale. As our colleague was just saying with AWS Personalize, the amount of data required to do this is Absolutely massive. It may, in fact, be larger than your user base. Great. Generate some synthetic data and slap it all together. If you don't have that marketing product cross problem, that's a great way to grow your data set really rapidly. Second, regulations are increasingly focused on that ontology I was mentioning, the difference between data that is a user's behavior and data that is a representation of attributes of the user's behavior. Those are legally different entities. And so our generative AI and ML synthesized data actually helps us get around some of that problem. And just to show you some of the accuracy, oh, maybe. All right, well, here's our first bug. It's a generative AI talk. You can't beat them. So what this diagram would show you is that a lot of the current tests are actually showing that this machine learning generated data, Databricks, for example, just released a paper that it's actually more accurate when we do personalization against it as opposed to other types of data. It's not a complete replacement, right? There's errors. The data introduces, again, that jitter component of it. But it does get us improvements in both scale and lift to the tune of 5 to 10% of accuracy. So just to reiterate, back through that framework, we talked a lot about how LLMs, generative AI, are really focused on helping us build on the fundamentals. The fundamentals are personalization has been proven time and time again to increase click-through. It increases whatever your end reward is, your goal, it's purchases, it's views, it's consumptions, it's pumping at the gas station. So the strategy is really key there to pulling through into the AI. AICX is both an art and a science, and you can see here in these diagrams with all of those moving parts, some of this seems to fall apart. Blitzscaling, hypergrowth, great terms, but again, we're using this to reduce the amount of work. You saw, for example, we can generate an entire page. We can generate hundreds of pages of content recommendations just using some of these models. Again, cut price, add capacity. Front-end buy versus build versus hybrid. As we mentioned, the first diagram shows you how easy it is in some ways to do the hybrid approach or to buy. The second diagram hopefully makes it a little clear that that's a better buy decision. And then finally, that back-end buy versus build versus hybrid being a buy decision. So with that, I will wrap up my talk 2 minutes early, and thank you very much.